History as it happens, November 30th, 2023. What if slavery without the Civil War?
7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all
160 Novembers ago, Abraham Lincoln, at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery on the battlefield at Gettysburg, delivered one of the greatest speeches in U.S. history. But what if the Confederates had won the battle that July? Or what if the Civil War had never happened? How long would slavery have endured in our country with its entrenched problems of racism and economic inequality? Well, depending on how you approach that question, you could be missing something important about what actually did happen: the destruction of human chattel slavery in America. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
If the United States adopts the anti-slavery project, then 25 years from now, the last state will pass a gradual abolition statute. And the gradual abolition statutes generally freed everyone born after that date, right? So anyone born the day before the last law was passed 25 years from now and lived to the age of 75, it would be 100 years. That, I think, is what's going on in Lincoln's mind, that notion. But it doesn't mean that, slaves aren't going to be freed much more rapidly than that. The first emancipation suggests that once it starts, it goes much more rapidly than the gradual timetable makes it look.
November 1863. A few months after some 50,000 soldiers from both armies were killed, wounded, captured, or gone missing, President Lincoln invoked the principle of human equality and called for a new birth of freedom.
7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war.
Hold on, cut. Who are you? Who hired you for this role?
You did.
All right, well, that's it. You're out of here. I suppose Daniel Day-Lewis was unavailable.
I can't accomplish a goddamn thing of any human meaning or worth until we cure ourselves of slavery and end this pestilential war. And whether any of you or anyone else knows it, I know I need this. This amendment is that cure. We're stepped out upon the world stage now, with the fate of human dignity in our hands.
Steven Spielberg's Lincoln, of course. Well, maybe I should have reached out to James Getty, the Abe Lincoln impersonator you heard at the top of the podcast. He delivered the Gettysburg Address at the 150th anniversary ceremony held by the National Park Service at the battlefield.
we have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that nation.
The microphone kind of ruins the effect, huh? Well, anyway, the Gettysburg Address and Lincoln's second inaugural address are etched in the walls of the Lincoln Memorial here in Washington. The second inaugural is a mesmerizing speech. Lincoln says the war is God's punishment for slavery. And he closed with the immortal words, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations."
Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah.
This is the second episode in our occasional series on major counterfactual questions in history. What if? What if the Civil War didn't break out in 1861? How long would it have taken to rid the country of slavery peacefully? Was it even possible to peacefully end slavery, given the South's devotion to the peculiar institution? By asking this question, we are obligated to understand what did happen. The Civil War just didn't happen by accident. It was caused by the political conflict over slavery's future, which led to the election of the first anti-slavery president in 1860, Abraham Lincoln. Republicans were trying to end slavery, slowly and peacefully, but its ultimate extinction was their goal. The short answer to the question is, we don't know. We can't say how long slavery may have endured without the Civil War. But a one-sentence answer is not enough to fill a podcast. So we welcome back historian Jim Oakes, author of many must-read books on this subject. And I can say that for sure because I've read them all, including Freedom National, The Destruction of Slavery in the United States. Jim Oakes, welcome back, my friend.
Glad to be here, as always.
So you and I have talked in the past a little bit about counterfactuals, and I want to do this occasional series of podcasts. What if? My first one was, what if Kennedy and Vietnam? I wanted to do about one per month. Then a war broke out in the Middle East, so I haven't been able to get to one until now. So we're going to do what if slavery without the Civil War. You told me that people ask you that question all the time. How long would slavery have lasted had it not been for the Civil War? Why don't we start there? Who are these people? They just approach you on the street and say, hey, man, what's with this?
No. Actually, the proverbial man on the street doesn't ask me that question. It's my fellow historians who do it. And it's not simply out of the blue that they ask the question. I have been trying to make the case for a long time now that the Republican Party represented a serious threat to slavery, that the secession was not a historical overreaction to a non-existent threat, that the Republicans went into the war with an agenda, what I call the anti-slavery project, that they believed would put slavery on a course of ultimate extinction. And that phrase that famously comes from Lincoln, he wants to put slavery on a course of ultimate extinction. Actually, lots of Republicans talk that way about ultimate extinguishment, final extinction of slavery, and they had an agenda. And I don't think people are aware of it, or fully aware of it. I don't think my fellow historians are fully aware of it. So when I give talks to a room full of historians, they'll raise their hand and they say, would the anti-slavery project have worked if there wasn't a civil war? So that's the counterfactual that I keep getting ever since I started talking about the book you're holding in your hand.
Yes, I have Freedom National here, one of your great books. Matter of fact, Eric Foner, another fine historian, he did a blurb on the back of Freedom National saying, this remarkable book offers the best account ever written of the complex historical process known as emancipation. Wow, that is high praise. But I like how he says historical process, right? I often talk about history as events, history as a process. But we'll get back to that. But about counterfactual analysis, it could be really silly, right? What would have happened there?
That particular question is particularly silly.
Well, how do you as a historian use counterfactuals? My first guest in this series, Frederick Logevall, talked about how he thinks counterfactual analysis can be really helpful.
Most historians sort of seat of the pants instinctively reject the idea. But I think, as a matter of fact, anytime you say that this thing was caused by that thing, there's always an implicit counterfactual in what you're saying. If I say the cause of the Civil War was slavery, I'm implicitly saying, sometimes consciously, the cause of the Civil War was not states' rights, was not the tariff. You're ruling out alternatives, right? In that sense, every causal claim made by a historian is filled with counterfactuals. There are social historians who began 30, 40 years ago recovering the agency of the slaves in the process of emancipation. And it's a very important body of work. But when they say the slaves freed themselves, the counterfactual in their minds is Lincoln had nothing to do with it, or Lincoln was dragged into it. So there's always a counterfactual somewhere hidden in any causal argument. In that sense, I think historians are insufficiently aware of the degree to which they themselves rely on counterfactuals. You can go crazy with it. What if Longstreet had hurried up on the second day at Gettysburg? Things like that. And And,
Yeah, there are
also,
pitfalls there that you can get crazy with it, as you say. I mean, what if Abraham Lincoln had never been born? I mean, right?
Yeah,
But
right.
I think they're helpful. I'm not a historian, but I like to talk about them because I actually find
Yeah.
them helpful in understanding what did happen rather than
Yes.
speculating about what might
Yes.
have
Yes.
happened.
When it forces you to think more carefully. If someone says to me in a public talk, the cause of the Civil War was states' rights or Southern rights, I have to be able to say why I think that's incorrect and why I think the alternative. So those kind of counter arguments force me to think more clearly. But there's a more formal type of counterfactual analysis. Let me give you the most famous example that I know of. When I was younger, there was a very distinguished economic historian named Robert Fogel, who was, until this year, the only economic historian to win the Nobel Prize. And he won the prize for inventing, really applying sophisticated econometric techniques to history. And they called it cliometrics, right? It became notorious when they published a not very good book, a slapdash book called Time on the Cross about slavery. But he became famous for a counterfactual argument that the United States could have developed just as rapidly and just as impressively as it did without building any railroads, right? It could have used canals and turnpikes and all of that stuff, right? Lots of historians went crazy about this, right? But that's not the way it did happen. The thing about it is, he's an economist. He teaches in an economics department. If you are a leader of an underdeveloped country and you need to build a transportation infrastructure in order to promote the economic development of your country, and you have these various options, turnpikes, canals, railroads, and railroads are really, really expensive, and canals will do just as well. You need that kind of factual analysis to be able to show that you can get to where you want developmentally this other way. In that sense, counterfactual analysis at that high level of formality is important for reasons a lot of historians don't fully appreciate.
And when it comes to slavery and the Civil War, I think most people, although maybe I shouldn't generalize, most people understand that slavery was the primary cause of the Civil War. But how, right? We got to go deeper than that. And maybe
Right.
this question I'm asking here is maybe not the right way of looking at it. I mean, sure, slavery may have eventually died off had there been no Civil War, but the Civil War just doesn't happen. It comes about as a result of what was going on in the 1850s, the conflict over slavery. So in a way, I'm maybe looking at the problem from the wrong end of the telescope. I don't know.
Well, we can get back to the question of what would have happened
We will.
had there been no Civil War.
We will. We're talking big picture
but
stuff here, but go ahead, yeah.
if you got a room full of, let's say you went to the annual meeting of the Organization of American Historians and you got them in a big ballroom and there's 1,000 of them, and you said, how many people in this room do not believe slavery was the cause of the Civil War? And no one would raise their hand. Or alternatively, how many of you think slavery was the cause of the Civil War? And everyone in the room, 990 out of 1,000 would say slavery caused the Civil War. But when you ask them to demonstrate that, they will almost always cite Southern secessionists, right? As the South left the Union to protect slavery. And it's hard to deny given the evidence. But if you ask them if the South had good reason to leave, if you ask them if the Republican Party or Lincoln represented a serious threat to slavery, they accept, in other words, the pro-slavery origins of the Civil War. What they are skeptical of are the anti-slavery origins of the Civil War. And that's where I'm the sore thumb among my fellow historians.
Well, how could there be one without the other? People are reacting to something that's happening.
Well, it ends up secession is a hysterical overreaction to a non-existent threat. That's what you're backing into.
One other big picture issue here. I don't think that this is merely an academic or historical question, although that is interesting to talk about. But the way people approach or answer this question how long would slavery have lasted had it not been for the Civil War, also tells us something about how they view the nature of our country and our current
Right.
politics. We've gotten into this with a number of our conversations about Frederick
Right.
Douglass, etc.
Right.
For instance, folks who ignore the link between anti-slavery politics and the Civil War, as if the war just kind of happens, or as you say, it was a hysterical reaction in the South, they might argue that, well, we would still have slavery today. It was almost an accident that slavery somehow got washed away in all of this.
It privileges the historical significance of an ideology. The ideology of racism exists, but it exists only by definition, exists in very specific contexts. So the ideology that you need to justify slavery isn't the same thing as an ideology that you later use to justify Jim Crow. The content may be different, but the point is that something substantial has changed, and you're just focusing on the continuity of an ideological justification for it, right? I don't think racism is enough to explain why in the late 19th century, let's go back. I don't think racism is enough to explain why colonial Americans imported slaves to work on plantations. They imported slaves to work on plantations because they couldn't get any other workers to come and work on plantations, right? They tried indentured servants and it didn't work, right? And so racism becomes the justification for focusing exclusively, eventually, the exclusive use of Africans only when somebody starts saying, I don't think that's right. It's like you said, what are the secessionists responding to? Responding to something. You get a racist justification. You don't need a racist justification for slavery if no one's questioning slavery. Right? It's when people start questioning slavery, and when they do so in terms of, let's say, the universal, human rights to freedom, which apply equally to blacks and whites, you're going to get a racist justification saying they don't apply to blacks and whites alike. Right? Racism is used to justify the social order of any given time and place. The slaveholders were just as inclined, maybe more inclined, to cite the Bible to justify slavery. And there's a continuous line of ideological justification for every form of social order that exists in the United States, North and South, Jim Crow, slavery, Northern racial discrimination, whatever. There's a continuous use of the Bible by Christians. Right? Would you say that given the pervasiveness of Christianity, slavery would never have gone away? I mean, it's just a different ideological rationale. It's another part of the ideological rationale, but you're giving the ideology the causal force that I don't think it can sustain.
So, could slavery have ended peacefully? It's a legitimate question, but then it is now incumbent on us to explain why Americans were willing to resort to massive amounts of violence to, well, on one side, destroy slavery, on the other, defend it. Of course, they may not have known the Civil War was going to last as long as it did when they embarked upon it, but they still persisted in it for as long as they did. We're going to get into the history now. And one place to start, and maybe some people start and end here, because if they can get Abraham Lincoln on their side, then, well, you got Lincoln as your ally. You don't have to do any more arguing or researching. What did Lincoln think about slavery's potential lifespan? I think at one point he said maybe 100 years it would have lasted.
It's a little like there are like 3 slaves in New Jersey in 1860 left over from the gradual emancipation process, right? So if you were inclined, you could say slavery persisted in the North right up to the Civil War. Well, sure, that's true in the most minimal technical sense, but it's also profoundly misleading, right? What Lincoln actually says is, if slavery were to be abolished in the most peaceful, most gradual way, the last slave would, die 100 years from now. But that's not the same thing as saying that's what he wanted or that's what he expected. There's no proposal built into that observation. When it came down to it, when he actually, during the Civil War, started proposing laws for gradual abolition to the border states, he got more and more radical. So the first one he proposes for Delaware in late 1861, says, it's up to you. I don't write these laws. You write these laws. I would say get it over with as quickly as possible and no later than 35 years, maybe as quickly as 10 years and things like that. But by then, they're already emancipating slaves.
Yeah, and this is one man, although he is Abraham Lincoln, one man's prediction. There's a global context here as well. I mean, the Atlantic economy and what other countries around the world are doing with their enslaved populations.
Right. The thing is, they make it out like he's some kind of reactionary for saying that, but actually, Thaddeus Stevens, who was just about the most radical member of the House of Representatives, made almost exactly the same timetable. If the United States adopts the anti-slavery project, then 25 years from now, the last state will pass a gradual abolition statute. And the gradual abolition statutes generally freed everyone born after that date, right? So anyone born the day before the last law was passed 25 years from now and lived to the age of 75, it would be 100 years. That, I think, is what's going on in Lincoln's mind, that notion. But it doesn't mean that, slaves aren't going to be freed much more rapidly than that. The first emancipation suggests that once it starts, it goes much more rapidly than the gradual timetable makes it look.
And where as well is important. There was an upper South, a middle South, a lower South. We've talked about William W. Freeling's books on the South, antebellum United States.
Right.
I thought the strength of those books is to tell you about the different Souths, right? And the
Yes.
different. So if we're going to
Very important.
Yeah, if we're going to assess, how long slavery might have lasted had it not been for this horrible war, we then need to know how strong slavery was in the United States on the eve of the Civil War, just say the mid-1850s.
Right.
We know there were 4 million total slaves in the U.S. By the start of the Civil War, but it was weaker in some parts of the country than in others.
In some parts of the South.
Some parts of the South, right.
Everyone understood that. I mean, Freeling's his work shows that it was widely understood at the time that there was widespread fear in the South, in the lower South, that the upper South states would not be loyal should the need to secede arise, right? And he turned out to be correct. The 4 border states did not secede. The 4 slave states didn't secede. What I would add to that is that the anti-slavery politicians and voices in the North were just as aware of that and assumed that the process by which slavery would be abolished peacefully would begin in those border states. Right. That's where slavery was the weakest. That's where the politics of slavery could get going. Politics of anti-slavery could get going.
And what about economics, right? Those middle, well, I was going to say the middle South. No, those are the upper South states, middle of the country. You know what I mean? The upper South states, the 4 that...
Yeah, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri.
Yeah. Their economies were facing north by this time, right?
The northern parts of their economies were facing north, yes. I mean, the eastern shore of Maryland is still more slavery-oriented, but Baltimore and Wilmington are more northern-oriented, right? And so, and same with Lexington, Kentucky, and the same with St. Louis, and so the states themselves are internally divided between the areas that are more dependent and more attached to the northern economy than the southern economy. And it's one of the reasons why anti-slavery folks believed it would be possible to get those states to abolish slavery. It's not that they expected the slaveholders in those states to roll over. It's they expected, as happened in the North, that the anti-slavery forces would beat them.
This is a big question. I mean, we deal with this today when we talk about the economy now. Which direction is the national economy going, or in which parts of the country will certain industries be thriving or dying, right? So I guess what I'm trying to get at here is the slave power, right, in the middle and lower South. Were they looking at the upper South or even the territories where they were trying to expand slavery, even in places where it didn't seem to have much of a future at all, like Kansas, Nebraska? Did they see, New
Mexico.
Yeah, the future of the United States economy is not really looking good for our peculiar institution?
I think they understood that. I think they understood what they needed to maintain given the economic superiority of the northern economy was a political equilibrium. right? The only place they could be sure slavery would be protected from federal interference was the Senate, because they lost the House and they knew they'd lost the House. And that's why they were demanding an equilibrium in the Senate. For every slave state, for every free state admitted, you admit a slave state. If the Senate is always 50-50, they only need one northern doughface, a pro-slavery northerner with Southern principles, whatever, to prevent any serious anti-slavery attacks coming from the federal government, right? And that was their goal. So Jefferson Davis's proposals, right, until the eve of the Civil War, is to extend the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific Ocean, divide California in half so that the southern half is a pro-slavery state and the northern half is already an anti-slavery state, is already a state that's above slavery. And all the states below that line would be slave states, and all the states above that line would be free states, right? Yeah. Just to maintain the equilibrium in the Senate, in a situation in which the northern economy was clearly outpacing the southern economy.
About 2 years ago, our friend Sean Wilentz was on the podcast with me. We were discussing the filibuster, and I started off by talking about the filibustero, the pirate expeditions, or whatever you want to call them, these renegades who try to take over Central American countries to potentially add them, or Caribbean countries, to add them as slave states. I think Nicaragua was one place where they tried this, right?
Yes.
To your point about the importance of the Senate, right?
That's just an indication of the degree to which they wanted more territory for slave states, right? They wanted Cuba, annex Cuba and break it up into 3 or 4 slave states, right? And we're safe.
Yeah, these filibusters didn't get very far, but...
No. Yeah. Some of them got...
died violently. Yes.
Lined up and shot on.
So... I guess then the slave power could see the future of this institution as tenuous, but at the same time it was strong. I mentioned 4 million slaves in the U.S. in 1860. Right. The cotton economy was important. It wasn't as important as, say, the 1619 Project has made it out, that if something happened to slavery, the entire northern economy would collapse. I mean, that's a ridiculous argument. But it was an important part of not just the U.S. economy, but the Atlantic economy, right?
Sure. Well, if you're going to say the Atlantic economy, then you've already predisposed us to look at export statistics rather than like gross domestic product.
That's why I have you here, because of my missteps.
It's a great ancient historian named Moses Finley who used to decry the indestructibility of pots because it made ancient historians think that olive oil was a major part of the economy of ancient Greece and stuff like that, because they stored it in pots and the pots survived, right? So the modern counterpart to that is the fact that empires kept trade statistics because they got a lot of money from taxing imports and exports and things like that. So we have all these wonderful statistics on trade, but we don't have such great statistics on early modern gross domestic product and things like that. But, Yes, there is a kind of producerist ideology that thinks wealth comes from the people who produce goods. And the Southerners were saying, cotton is king. No nation on earth would dare destroy cotton. And they believed that if they withheld their cotton from the market, England would support the Confederacy and the northern economy would, collapse. And it's just, they were wrong, right? For one thing, the Northerners weren't attacking cotton. They were attacking slavery, and they were attacking slavery on the assumption an emancipated labor force would produce cotton more efficiently.
Well, as you say here in the preface to your book, Freedom National, Republicans never forgot the fundamental conflict of mid-19th century America was not the squabbling between moderates and radicals within the anti-slavery movement, but the life and death struggle between those who hated slavery and were prepared to risk war rather than extend its life, and those who defended slavery and were willing to go to war to preserve it. So when I asked the question, could slavery have ended peacefully, the Southern slaveocracy, or the pro-slavery people, they always anticipated, right, that if slavery were going to be ended, it would be done violently, right, through war. Am I right about that?
Well, there's always these Upper South colonizationists who imagine some way of gradually ending slavery, which I think was naive. But yes, by the 1850s, the dominant forces in Southern politics were insisting that if you're going to make war on slavery, it's going to be brutal and violent, and it's the only way slavery is going to end, right? The naivete, and for some historians, the flaw in the Republican Party's logic and Lincoln's logic is they would listen to these arguments and say, but we can end it. We can end it peacefully. All we have to do is prevent it from expanding, not return your fugitive slaves, maybe tax the interstate slave trade, do all these things, abolish slavery in Washington, D.C., and maybe getting progressively more aggressive about it. And the slave economy that is already inferior, manifestly inferior to the freewheeling, rapidly developing capitalist economy in the North, will wither away and die. And the slaveholders themselves will be forced to realize that it would be in their interests to abolish slavery.
So then let's talk about anti-slavery politics and what became the cordon of freedom, the Republican strategy for confining slavery in order to kill it.
That's what they believed. They believed that slavery was expansive because it had no other way of sustaining itself in the long run. And so that if you cut slavery off from expanding, eventually you've inflicted a slow motion sentence of death. It cannot survive without expanding. If you prevent it from expanding, it will die.
Economically, politically, all of the above?
If it can't expand economically, it won't expand politically.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons, the North expands economically and it wins the House of Representatives, and the South loses the House, despite the 3/5 clause, which gives the South extra strength in the South. They've lost it by 1820, right? And the more that goes on, this is important to understand when that question of what would have happened if there hadn't been a civil war comes up. It's usually the assumption is, well, Southern slave society is the richest, most powerful slave society in the history of the world, certainly in the world at that time. And there's no reason to believe that it was going to die in any way. But that's a static picture. That's assuming that the trajectory that the Northern economy was on wouldn't continue. And we know what happens to the American economy in the late 19th century. By 1900, the U.S. is the industrial leader of the world. It's at a staggering economic growth, right? And it didn't work in the South, right? And the South, it was being left behind. The Southerners knew it was being left behind by this transformation that was taking place in the North. Sometimes they said it was being left behind because they passed these tariff laws that disproportionately favored and stuff like that. But still, they understood that the Northern economy was clearly growing in ways that the Southern economy was not, however dependent they might have been on cotton, right? And the assumption that the anti-slavery project could not have worked without the war is based on the assumption that the North would not have continued along that extraordinary trajectory and so far outpaced the South that by 1900 or whenever, it could have just flipped all sorts of switches, closed down the interstate slave trade, do all sorts of things, tax the sale of every single slave.
All of this was evident to the slave power. They could see what happens. Because all this stuff had been in circulation for years. There's a question of having enough power to do it, political power to do it.
Right. So I don't know. When someone says, would it have worked without the Civil War? My answer is, I don't know, and you don't know. But the more important answer is, no matter how you answer that question, you are not coming to terms with the historical significance of the anti-slavery project. The historical significance of the anti-slavery project is twofold. One, it caused the Civil War. The reason the South seceded is because the president who represented a party was elected who was committed to the anti-slavery project, and that's why the slave states seceded. To get back to your original observation, why did they didn't secede for no reason? They were responding. That's what they were responding to, right? So that's the historical significance, the major historical significance of the anti-slavery project, no matter whether it would have worked or not without the Civil War. That's a distracting old question. right? And the second significance is having gone into the war with this commitment to the ultimate destruction of slavery, that project was radicalized by the war. They don't start from nothing and become anti-slavery. They start anti-slavery and become more and more radically anti-slavery as the war goes on.
And because they use the war as an opportunity to do things they may not have been able to do in peacetime, well, so what?
Exactly.
So what?
Exactly.
They were doing it.
Exactly.
And, talk of war and secession had been in the air for quite a while. I mean, the Southerners would talk of seceding if the North tried to do something about slavery, or this will lead to war, which doesn't mean the Northern anti-slavery people devised the cordon of freedom strategy to bring on a war.
No. Well, this is what I started to say earlier. There is some justice to the accusation that Lincoln was naive when he said, why are they leaving? We're not going to attack slavery anywhere where it exists. We have no intention of interfering with slavery where it exists. We're just going to do all these other things. And, the Southerners saw through that and said, look, you can't do indirectly what you're not allowed to do directly. If you can't attack slavery directly, you can't attack it indirectly the way you're talking about. Both are illegitimate, right? So they understood exactly what the indirect assault on slavery meant. And they, like I said, they saw the writing on the wall.
And when you say putting it in the course of ultimate extinction, that's pretty clear of what you intend to do.
This is what I don't understand. He's committed explicitly, Lincoln and the Republicans are committed to the extinction of slavery. Why pretend that's not the case?
So about secession, though, needing the trigger, the precipitating cause, there is a debate as to, well, how many Southerners really wanted to take the leap, like the fire eaters in South Carolina. They've been called the fanatics who tipped the scales in favor of secession. Had it not, this is another counterfactual, had it not been for them. I mean, the entire South doesn't go right away.
That's Bill Freeling's very strongly in that direction. A heavy emphasis on contingency. Had they not completed the Charleston-Savannah Railroad just in time to get the Charlestonians down to Savannah to make their case, maybe there wouldn't have been a civil war. I'm not persuaded by that. There's all sorts of contingencies, in history. There always are contingencies, but that strikes me as implausible.
But what about the fire eaters in South Carolina? I mean, were they hysterical fanatics or what? What's the deal there?
There's certainly, in certain ways, the most radical, but the fact that South Carolina adopted the secession ordinance first, it doesn't follow that all the other states were following South Carolina's lead. They had already organized conventions and secession conventions in the other states as well. They were going too. The Deep South was going, and the only substantial opposition in the Deep South, from within the slaveholding class at least, is probably in Louisiana. This question of whether or not a majority of Southerners supported secession is tricky.
Yeah, because when? Right away? Or maybe we wait and see what Lincoln's going to do?
Right, that's part of it. None of the states looked like they had electoral majorities in favor of secession in November of 1860. Where they were by the day after Fort Sumter is different. The mood of a country can change dramatically in a short period of time, and we've seen it in our own lifetimes. So the thing that always struck me about it is some glaringly obvious failure on the part of the secessionists is staring us in the face and was absolutely crucial to the fate of the Confederacy. And that is their failure to get 4 of the 15 slave states to go along with them. And as Lincoln said, if he doesn't have Kentucky, he's not going to keep, that's the end of it, right? And he understood, and the Southerners understood. Jefferson Davis did everything he could to get those states. Missouri, he was sending weapons to the secessionists in Missouri and things like that. He wanted those states because he knew, no free state joined the Confederacy. 4 of the 15 slave states, and that's a monumental failure on the part of the secessionists to unify the South in ways that had incalculable significance for the Civil War.
Yeah, and that's what makes secession look like a panic move.
Well, it was certainly turned out to be a spectacular miscalculation.
Yes. In the annals of warfare, there have been many of those. They
Right.
bring about the exact
But,
consequence that
you
you were
know,
trying to avoid. They seceded to save or protect slavery, and the
right.
war brings about its destruction.
Yes. It was the Republicans who understood that, ironically. They were saying, what the hell's the matter with you people going to war? You think you're going to protect slavery by causing a war? That's the worst thing you can do. The number of Republicans during the secession crisis who say this means abolition, this means emancipation. They're assuming that in a protracted war, slavery couldn't survive a protracted war for a
Yeah.
variety of historical and legal reasons.
This raises another issue where people will try to throw a monkey wrench into your argument, and it's another counterfactual here. But all right, the Confederate routs the Union in 1861, and support for the war effort in the North collapses.
I don't actually have a problem with that kind of analysis. I don't want to get too contemporary about this. A few months after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I thought if a war goes on more than a couple of months, it's going to become a stalemate. And a stalemate like that, the side with the greatest resources tends to win out. And I think that's what's happening right now. And I think Jefferson Davis and certainly Robert E. Lee understood halfway through the war they didn't have the resources
Well, they gambled
to
right?
win this, and that the only way they could do this was by doing something like invading Pennsylvania, that would so demoralize the North that they could gain a political victory at the polls. Right? Lincoln would lose in 1864, and they could sue for peace. That's the only way. I think by 1862, 63, certainly, Northern victory was inevitable. In military terms, the military victory of the North was just not going to be stopped. All sorts of monkey wrenches could be thrown in the way. Lee's very smart and very powerful, blah, 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 and all that stuff. But in the long run, I don't think it was going to lose militarily.
This is
If
by
it was
you
going to
said by
lose,
mid 1863.
yeah, after Gettysburg and Vicksburg, if not sooner. I'm not as afraid of inevitability arguments as some historians are. And partly I've been validated, at least I take some validation in this from Adam Tooze's remarkable books on World War II, in which he also says, not too far into the war, German military defeat was inevitable. But that doesn't mean the Confederacy couldn't win its independence. It could do it politically. If they could do it politically, if the horrific deaths of the Virginia campaign in early 1864, the fighting, the protracted series of battles between Lee and Grant that produced staggering numbers of Union deaths and Confederate deaths, but if that had produced enough war weariness in the North to defeat Lincoln, this was Lee's calculation. If they could defeat Lincoln, politically, they could gain their independence that way.
Yeah, well, Lincoln thought for a while he was going to lose. So
Yeah,
what was
yeah.
the Copperheads? That was the Northern Democrats running against him. What was their view on
The Peace Democrats?
Peace
They were war
Democrats.
Democrats, right?
Yeah, so this does get complicated. So if Lincoln loses to, well, he was running against his former general there, what was their position on the war? Would they have sought a peace and allowed slavery to continue in the South? Was that their position?
McClellan was not a peace Democrat. He intended to defeat
Okay.
the
So the war would have continued.
but there would not have been a 13th Amendment. The military victory of the North would have continued. I mean, it would have happened, but slavery would not have been abolished.
Well, that's the key piece there. Another more important or maybe more useful question to ask is, not what would have happened had the South won the First Battle of Bull Run, but the connection between emancipation and war. You write here on page 242, Limited emancipation had been a feature of limited war, hoping to provoke Unionist slaveholders to give up their rebellion and convince the tide of escaping contrabands would sweep slavery away. Republicans had initially restricted emancipation to slaves who came within Union lines in the seceded states, but by the spring of 1862, having lost their faith in Southern Unionism and no longer persuaded that self-emancipation would be enough to destroy slavery, Republicans began calling for a harder war that included universal emancipation in the seceded states. Really, this might be the most important issue of all I'm raising with you here, is that it wasn't a war that was about only preserving the Union first that moves to emancipation. The two are always intertwined. And actually, that's what you say. You say in your book that you had not believed that prior to writing and researching this.
Or in my more recent book, as I put it in my more recent book, the purpose of the war was the reconstruction of the Union, but not just any Union. They want to restore the Constitution, but not just any Constitution. Their understanding of the Constitution was that it was an anti-slavery document. Their understanding of the Union as the founders intended it to be was a Union where there would be no slavery, right? So in a way, Jefferson Davis was a Unionist. He didn't want the war. Stephen Douglas was a Unionist, right? But they had very different conceptions of the relationship between slavery and the Union than the Republicans had. And the Republicans went into the war believing correctly that the Union had been torn apart because of slavery. And they gradually moved to an increasingly radical position on what the United States, what the federal government should be doing, so that after Gettysburg and Vicksburg, you hear increasing numbers of Republicans saying, it starts earlier. This war should not end without the cause of the war having been extinguished. And how they were going to do that was the tricky thing.
But those ideas had been around, right, when it came to conduct of war and treatment of enslaved people?
Sure, on a much smaller scale, but the precedents were critical, right? The precedents were already there from the American Revolution. You emancipate slaves who abandon the enemy's lines and come to your lines. Both sides did it during the American Revolution. Both sides did it during the War of 1812. The Americans did it during the Seminole War. They freed slaves who came into American lines from the Seminoles, from Florida, right? The precedents were there. It's just that do it on a scale like it was happening in the Civil War, almost from the start, because from the start, the Republicans, anti-slavery Northerners, never liked returning fugitive slaves to their owners. They never did. The fights between northern and southern states over the disposition of fugitive slaves go back to the 1780s. And it was an irreconcilable conflict. They never came to a compromise that satisfied both the Northerners and the Southerners, right? Because the Northerners just didn't like returning fugitive slaves. So going into the war, they had legal theories. They had come through the 1850s with infamous series of fugitive slave renditions in which the federal government, the president orders Union troops into northern cities to return a single fugitive slave. And the Republicans come into the war saying, no matter what you think the Constitution says, no matter what you think the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 says, it does not say, neither says, that these laws and these constitutional provisions are to be enforced by the U.S. military. It is not their business to enforce, right? And so right from the start, Republicans are saying, they're passing resolutions in the House of Representatives saying it is not the business of the Union and armies and navies to be returning fugitive slaves. Because the question of the legal status, the freedom or enslavement of a human being is not something that an ordinary soldier is qualified to determine. And they have been saying this for 50 years before the war. And that's standard anti-slavery thought. So when Union troops start invading the South and thousands of slaves start running to Union lines, ultimately 500,000, it has profoundly different consequences from what they were during the American Revolution or the War of 1812.
Now, 500,000, that's a large number. It's one out of every eight. One out of every 8 slaves. So
by the end of the war, that's how many were in Union lines. Wow. And therefore presumably emancipated. It's still only 1 out of 8, and there was no telling what would have happened without a constitutional amendment.
So, Jim Oakes, we'll wrap up with this question. Why is this so contentious or controverted? I don't, what's the term that historians use? Contested issue. The Civil War is one of the top 3 most important events in American history. Revolutionary War, Civil War, American victory in the Second World War. 1945 launches us on the American century. So, I mean, this is vital to understand this issue, especially nowadays and all the other times you've been on my podcast. We've been discussing these historical matters through a current lens, right? How people understand politics, understand race, understand historical causation.
Right.
Why is this one? Well, you touched on it at the very beginning, but we circle all the way around here on the podcast. You know, the anti-slavery northern causes of Southern secession.
Yeah. I wish I understood better why. I think it has to do with the degree to which the civil rights movement reoriented American historical scholarship to think about slavery primarily through the lens of racial ideology, right? Rather than as fundamentally a labor system that racial ideology justified. And that overwhelming sense of the persistence of racism, has made it very, very difficult for many historians to imagine that there was a serious anti-slavery politics that caused the Civil War. It's just very difficult. And that comes down most clearly in debates about Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, because people cherry pick something he said that, sounds a little racist. Or, I mean, the level of discourse on
If he's
this.
a racist, he couldn't be anti-slavery.
I mean, that's what happens. I'm sorry. That's what happens in, public discourse on Twitter. I mean, that's not how historians talk about it, or is it?
I'm afraid it is.
Oh, boy. Then we're in trouble.
I think it's just the profession has become so large and so disconnected that the people who write about Abraham Lincoln are not read by the people who write about African Americans. So you can read very good books on various aspects of African American history before and into the Civil War. And when they get to Lincoln and the Republicans, they sound like blithering idiots to anyone even remotely familiar with Lincoln scholarship. They don't know the Lincoln scholarship. They don't care about the Lincoln scholarship. They're committed to a perfectly reasonable desire to recover the agency of African Americans in all of these historical developments. But the Lincoln people don't read the social history, and the social historians don't read the Lincoln stuff, and it's
maybe I'll write a book about World War II that only takes into account the Allies' view of what was going on. I mean, I don't know how to write a history book without taking into the whole picture.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. The way historians trip over themselves to emphasize Northern racism in various books on the Civil War is amazing to me. I mean, did you ever interview Kate Mazer?
I did, about her terrific book, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a terrific book. I think she's a very fine historian. It's an amazing book. It's a profoundly important book, and it will have no effect on the way historians write about Lincoln and the Civil War. I saw her a couple of weeks ago, and I said, the problem you have is like the problem I have. That is, she wants to show that although the 14th Amendment certainly arises out of the particular conditions in the earliest months of Reconstruction, the way Republicans respond to those conditions is shaped by these decades of struggle over Black civil rights. And I'm trying to say exactly the same thing. The way the Republicans respond to the Civil War is conditioned by decades and decades, longer than she's writing about, fighting, of refusing, of disliking the idea that Northerners are under some obligation to facilitate the capture and return of slaves who escape into the North. That they don't like to do it. They just don't like to do it, and they don't want to do it, and they're angrier than ever. So yes, they're responding to the particular conditions of the war as they arise, but they're responding in ways that are conditioned by decades of struggle. It's more than that too. There's a whole, if you want a counterfactual history, it's the dog that didn't bark is really interesting. because there's a whole history that has yet to be written of the various attempts by Northern racists to get legislation, get discriminatory legislation through Northern legislatures that failed. And we don't know about that because we read the statutes that got passed, but we don't notice how often the racists failed, right? Kate's book does better than any book I've ever seen to recapture that conflict. But there's a lot more to be said about that conflict. Right? So they don't just all of a sudden in 1866 wake up and decide, oh, you know what? Let's have equal rights. Let's have a civil rights bill. Let's have a 14th Amendment. It didn't just occur to them to do that. There's a very real sense in which the constant fighting over fugitive slaves is always a fight about black civil rights. Because what the Northerners are saying is you cannot come in and pick a black person off our streets, deny them basic civil rights, the right to a trial by jury, the right to habeas corpus, those kinds of things. So the fighting over fugitive slaves is always a fight about slavery and a fight about black civil rights. It's always there.
Well, Jim, I'll wrap up. I said I was going to wrap up. I lied. I'm going to ask a question that no one can answer, not even you. How is the book coming?
I warned you not to ask this the last time.
That's right.
Slowly,
And no
but it's
author,
coming.
and no author likes
Slowly,
that
but-
question. You, Sean,
Slowly, but
and
it's
Robert Caro are all working on.
Sean will get done first. Right? Let's hope Robert Caro gets it done.
Yes, don't jinx him.
Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the faithful lightning of his terrible smith sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, parallels between Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982 and the war in Gaza today.
Israel must have learned that there is no way it can impose its own solutions on hatreds as deep and bitter as those that produced this tragedy. If it seeks to do so, it will only sink more deeply into the quagmire that looms before it.
That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.